Found by an international court, only the U.S. Supreme Court. In March, a ruling from the Supreme Court cleared the way for the execution to proceed. In considering whether to stay the execution, Governor Perry's office said the facts of this crime must be considered. Facts a spokeswoman described as among the most horrific that have ever crossed the governor's desk. 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena and 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman took a shortcut home on that night 15 years ago. A group of teens in the middle of a gang initiation raped them and used a belt and shoelaces to strangle them and stomped on their necks.
She didn't deserve to die. She died in a very, very cruel way. And this guy, he deserves to die.
At the time, Medellin was 18. He confessed to the crime. One of the gang members already has been executed and another is on death row. Now, for Jose Medellin, everyone now is waiting for word from the U.S. Supreme Court and the Texas governor's office. They will have the final say, and the execution, should it happen, will be sometime between now and midnight Central Time. Kitty?
Thanks very much, Lisa Sylvester. That brings us to the question in tonight's poll. Do you believe that the state of Texas was right to refuse to bow to the pressure of the International Court and the White House in the case of Jose Medellin? That's a yes or no vote. Cast your vote at LouDobbs.com. We'll bring you the results later in the broadcast. Well, joining me now from Houston is Congressman Ted Poe of Texas. And Congressman Poe was a criminal court judge in Harris County, Texas, for 22 years. He does not believe the World Court has any jurisdiction in this case. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kitty.
You know, you had extreme proximity to this case, did you not?
Yes, it was tried next door to my courtroom, and very familiar with the case, the family, and the facts of the case.
Do you believe that if justice will be served if Jose Medellin is executed?
No question about it. First of all, there's no question about his guilt. There's overwhelming guilt. He confessed. He bragged about it to his other gang members. He carried a souvenir of a Mickey Mouse watch of one of the girls. So guilt is not an issue. And, of course, no one knew that he was a Mexican national. You got to remember, he never asked to see a Mexican consulate. His lawyers didn't ask. The consulate didn't mention it. His family didn't mention it at the time of the trial. It never even was mentioned until after the trial, after he got the death penalty, and after his case was upheld on appeal. 10 years later, he comes and says, oh, by the way, I was a Mexican national. So he was not denied the right. No one ever thought that he was a Mexican national. Everybody assumed that he was an American citizen at the time of the trial. Mm-hmm. So that's the key to the fact that all courts in the United States upheld the conviction. The World Court has no jurisdiction over Texas courts.
You know, as states' rights versus the jurisdiction of the International Court, is it a U.S. sovereignty issue also?
It is. And the Supreme Court mentioned that in their opinion in March, that the United States is not bound by this decision, and specifically Texas courts are not bound by the World Court. The World Court has no jurisdiction. The Mexican government decided to sue the United States long after this trial was over with. You know, the trial was tried, or the murders occurred 15 years ago. And it's a delay tactic by those that oppose the death penalty under any circumstance. The Hague in the Netherlands has no jurisdiction in this case, never has. And Governor Perry is right to allow this execution to take place. As you mentioned earlier in this broadcast, this is one of the worst cases ever. So Medellin is not the choir boy people want to make him out to be. He's certainly not the poster person that the anti-death penalty crowd ought to be talking about.
Why do you think that President Bush has agreed to revisit this case, has agreed with the International Court?
I don't know. I'm perplexed by that. I would hope that the president would take the side of the victims in this case, the two teenage girls that were murdered. But he took the side of the Mexican government, and he ordered the Texas courts to revisit this case. They, in all due respect to the president, said, you have no jurisdiction to tell us what to do in Texas. And the Supreme Court upheld that ruling, and that's why this execution is proceeding. The president, the Secretary of State, the Mexican government, and The Hague have no jurisdiction as to what takes place. And the Supreme Court has ruled according to our law and our Constitution. None of those entities have any say-so what takes place in Texas.
You know, let's talk about the role of Congress, because members of the House Judiciary Committee have written, three of them actually, have sent a letter to Texas Governor Perry asking him to stay Medellin's execution until Congress can look into the matter. Let me quote for a moment from the letter. As the Supreme Court recognized compliance compliance with the Vienna Convention is a critical aspect of national security and foreign policy, including the reciprocal treatment of U.S. persons overseas. Now, the legislation before the House evaluates the impact on any violations of the Vienna Convention. What do you think of this effort?
I think this is a move by people who are just opposed to the death penalty. Once again, it's important, Kitty, to remember that he wasn't denied the privilege to talk to his consulate. No one ever mentioned it. He never mentioned that he was a Mexican national. No one knew about it at the trial until years later. And our Supreme Court has ruled that that had no bearing in his case. The evidence was overwhelming. Even if he'd have got to talk to his Mexican consulate, it wouldn't have affected the verdict of the jury. The jury would have still assessed the death penalty to this individual, as 4 other juries did with 4 of the other defendants.
You know, Congressman Poe, this has generated a good bit of comment internationally. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon today called on the U.S. to obey the decision of the International Court. Also, Amnesty International weighing in here. They called on the governor to stay the execution, also citing the World Court ruling. What do you think about this many voices being raised about a case like this?
Well, there are many courts, the World Court and foreign countries, especially the Europeans, and the UN, are opposed to the death penalty. In Texas, we have the death penalty. And the message is clear: don't murder people in Texas. And we don't care where you're from. If you do, you're going to get the death penalty. And that's what the jury has said in this case. And so what all these people say, and trying to influence now the verdict 15 years later, is wrong. They have no jurisdiction. They have no say-so. Congress has no bearing what Congress says about this case at all. And so I think that the execution should proceed. The fact that he did not request talking to his consulate, I think, is the bearing and the most important issue. You know, everyone assumed he was an American citizen. And then after the trial's over with, he says he's a Mexican national. So it suited him better to be a Mexican national after the trial was over with. And the fact that he did not ask to talk to his consulate, his lawyers didn't, his family didn't, the consulate didn't, is justification for why it has no bearing in this case at all.
Right. We will be following this, obviously, as it unfolds throughout tonight and tomorrow. Congressman Poe, I'd like to ask you one quick question about Ramos and Campion case. The illegal alien drug smuggler, Aldrete Davila, is scheduled to be sentenced tomorrow. But is there any word from the White House about the letter that was signed by 75 people calling for the president, members of Congress, to call on the president to immediately commute the sentences of Ramos and Campion?
We haven't heard a word from the White House. My office hand-delivered that letter to the president last week before the break, and we have not heard. We've asked in a bipartisan way to commute the sentences, let these 2 men out based on time served and the facts of the case. We haven't heard a word. We hope that we do.
Congressman Ted Poe, thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Kitty.